Is the Bank of Canada raising its key interest rate again to 4.5%. With more on that and the violent incidents on Toronto's transit system is federal Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. Mr. Poilievre, thanks so much for your time this afternoon.
Good to be with you. Thank you for having me.
What do you think is the solution to this ongoing problem on the TTC, on transit systems across the country, and if a national task force is a waste of time and money?
It is a waste of time and money because we already know the solution, and it is to reverse Justin Trudeau's catch and release crime policies. Trudeau passed a law that allows repeat violent offenders who are newly arrested for additional violence to be released the same day on bail. And police officers from across Canada tell me this is the reason why we have so many violent offenses. It's not just Toronto. In Vancouver, just the other day, just outside of Vancouver, in Abbotsford, 4 people were shot in the course of one day. And then we see all the TTC attacks that have been happening. In Saskatchewan, a couple of guys went out and stabbed a whole group of First Nations people. And the attackers had already 60 different convictions. Why weren't they in jail? Why aren't these repeat violent offenders who've been arrested again and again behind bars? In Vancouver, for example, the same 40 offenders were arrested 6,000 times, 6,000 times in 1 year. That means 150 arrests per person per year. Those 40 offenders should be in jail, but because of Justin Trudeau's catch and release policies, they're out on the street stabbing, punching, and shooting innocent people.
You're touching on the bail issues, and that has been brought up as a serious point recently. Some would argue, though, a lot of the issues on the TTC recently appear to be greater issues with mental health concerns. And another issue here in Toronto is violence in schools, where bail issues doesn't particularly apply. These are youth offenders. These are teenagers in school as well. What would you propose to curb youth violence and schools?
Well, one thing we have to do is more recovery and treatment for drug addiction. In Alberta, for example, they have doubled the number of treatment beds for drug addiction, and the reality is that has cut the number of overdoses in half. That's one thing. Second, we need to take money from the ridiculous Trudeau policy of banning hunting rifles in rural communities and put that money into blocking the illegal transit of guns from the United States into our big cities, which are responsible for 82% of the gun violence in cities like Toronto. So bolster the borders, provide addiction and recovery programs, and put the real repeat violent offenders behind bars rather than turning them loose, as Trudeau has done, into our streets.
And particularly for youth in today, at schools today, we've had a lot of issues of violence at schools. These are kids. These are not dealing with bail concerns, not specifically major issues with gun control, but this is health and safety of our teens, of our kids.
Yeah.
What kind of help do they need? What more help do they need?
Well, they need a lot of help. A lot of young people lack hope these days because they think when they graduate from high school, what future do they have? They look at the fact they can't afford a home. They look, their parents are in desperate poverty. 1.5 million people ate at a food bank in a single month last year. And Justin Trudeau's inflation and rising interest rates have left many parents so desperate they can't take care of their kids. So that stress then goes on to the kids, who then act out in really awful ways. We need to restore hope. Our families are at a breaking point in this country after 8 years of Trudeau. That people can't afford the soaring crime and costs that Trudeau has imposed on them. We need to replace that hurt with hope. And that's what I'm going to do by tackling the inflation, making people's dollars go further, rewarding work by reforming our tax system so working class people bring home more of their paycheck. That would reduce a lot of the strain and the stress that so many families are feeling.
You're discussing inflation. Let's talk about the Bank of Canada raising its interest rate for the 8th consecutive time and potentially final time, expecting now to weigh its impact of the recent move. What is your reaction to the latest hike?
Well, it's another sucker punch from Justin Trudeau on Canadian families. Trudeau and his government promised Canadians rates wouldn't go up. He said, go out and borrow millions, borrow bucket loads of cash to buy that $1 million home, and you can count on low rates for a long time. Well, Trudeau was wrong. And now, if you bought $1 million house, you're paying an extra 40 grand a year in interest on the mortgage. The average house in Toronto now costs 7 grand a month in mortgage payments. 35-year-olds are stuck living in parents' basements. Families are going bankrupt. This is the result of Trudeau's inflationary policies. $500 billion of inflationary deficits have bid up the cost of the goods we buy and the interest we pay. The bank governor admits that Trudeau's deficits are boosting both inflation and interest rates. What we have to do is cap government spending, cut government waste, fire the high-priced consultants that are gobbling up $15 billion of our tax money every year, and put those savings into getting inflation down. We also need to reform our tax system to make work pay. Right now, the tax system punishes hard work and traps people in poverty. I'm going to reform it so that people keep more of their paycheck and less is clawed back in taxes and other government penalties.
Many experts have blamed a lot of the inflation issues on a slew of factors, including global events outside of our borders, including Russia's invasion of Ukraine and supply chain disruption. Inflation is now forecast to fall over the next several months into this year and then into next summer as well. Is this not evidence that the moves this government is making are indeed working?
You only need to go to a grocery store to answer that question. They're doing the only thing they're working at is raising the cost of food by 12% a year. House prices doubled under Justin Trudeau, and fuel prices are going through the roof. Nobody who's trying to feed a family thinks that Trudeau's policies are working. They're only working for the well-connected insiders who are getting the $1,000 a day contracts from the Liberal government. But when 1.5 million people are going to food banks in a single month, when the CEO of the Mississauga Food Bank says that some people are coming and asking her for help committing suicide, not because they're sick, but because they can't afford life in Trudeau's Canada, it's clearly not working. And that's why we have to get rid of Trudeau's inflationary deficits, reform taxes to reward work, and increase the purchasing power of our people. And just one thing on this nonsense about the Ukraine war causing the inflation. It's not causing inflation in Switzerland, which is right there in Europe. They have very little inflation in Switzerland. Why? Because they didn't print money. They're not running huge deficits. And war in Ukraine and the Middle East didn't cause inflation the last time Conservatives were in power. We had very low inflation, never went above 4%. This is, as the governor of the Bank of Canada says, domestic inflation caused by Trudeau's inflationary deficits. We've got to get rid of him and those deficits to bring down costs and bring up paychecks.
Mr. Poilievre, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon and coming on and speaking about violence on the TTC, ongoing violence and inflationary policy. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Let's bring home safe streets and more powerful paychecks.
Thank you, sir.